Hello, I'm Frank Gerard. Welcome to another Classic Country Conversations. I am pleased and honored to have with me again the author of Jim Reeves, His Untold Story. This is a fascinating book that had the pleasure and honor of narrating, and I have with me today again the author, Larry Jordan. Larry, welcome.
Hello, Frank. It's always good to be with you.
Absolutely, and same here. Now, July 31st, you know this and I know this. Every year we pause and have a moment of silence for what was a very sad day in country music, is when Jim passed away, correct?
Right.
And
Yes.
of course he died in a plane crash, as many viewers know. What led up to him flying and the plane crash? And just talk about it all you want. It's a
Well, I thought
fascinating
it would be
topic.
useful to kind of lay the groundwork
Yeah,
for why did Jim get interested in flying to begin with? And I'm
yeah.
going to take you through a little bit of history, and I think it'll become apparent why this idea formed in Jim's mind that he too could fly.
I think
Unfortunately,
that's
with
great. Yeah, and
disaster,
before we start, I
yeah,
just want to take a quick second to put in our little commercial here that you got to read this book, folks. If you haven't read the comprehensive book about the life and death of Jim Reeves, you got to read Jim Reeves' His Untold Story. It's available online on Amazon in both print version and what you're seeing here is the Audible version, which you can get on audible.com and also on Amazon.com. You got to get it. You got to get it. You got to get it. I love narrating it. I still love listening to it, even though it's my voice. So continue, Larry. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
well, I want to first give an endorsement of
Yeah.
this audiobook because it's fantastic. You know, people may not want to wade through my 672-page printed book or ebook, but the advantage of the audiobook is that you can listen to it little by little. You know, you're riding somewhere in a car, you're at the beach, got a little time, waiting for a dental appointment or whatever. Take the thing along, listen to it in increments, and pretty soon you've got the whole thing done. You didn't have to really exert any effort. Just
Yeah.
listen to Frank read. So I think it's
Right.
a great format.
And it is the fastest growing media form in this 2025 as we record this, audiobooks. And you could say that's good or bad. I mean, I think it's good because it sells books. I think it's bad because the attention span of so many of us today is not what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that people are much more likely to listen to an audiobook than they are to sit down and read a book. But either one is good. All right. So Larry, let's talk about the sad topic, the plane crash.
Okay, I will never forget when Mary and I discussed this years ago. She confided that Jim, and this is a direct quote, when he first had to fly, he was very much afraid, quote unquote. And I believe the first time he really had to fly was in December of 1954 when he went on his first tour to Europe, along with Forrest Tucker, the actor, and
Hmm.
people like Katharine Grant, who later became Mrs. Bing Crosby. They were over in Europe over the Christmas and New Year's holiday for a period of 18 days. And of course, to get there, he had to fly. He flew on military aircraft. And the trip was quite an exceptional experience. This is a man that had barely been out of Panola County, Texas, and all of a sudden he's halfway across the world. And there were a lot of memorable things. They saw the Christmas market over there, toured the Notre Dame Cathedral at Christmas. You can imagine how enthralling that was. And at one point, all the performers, including Jim, were performing aboard an aircraft carrier that was anchored off the coast of France. And when they came back again, they had to fly. Jim was apprehensive, but they performed on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is a video that so far has eluded our grasp. You know, they've been running reruns of Ed Sullivan. Hopefully that'll turn up sometime.
Right.
But the next time that Jim flew was in 1957 in April with a contingent of RC and Grand Ole Opry stars, including Hank Lachlan, Del Wood, of course, Jim's band, which was then called the Wagon Masters. It was not yet the Blue Boys. Mary Reeves got to go along on the trip, Herb Schuker, Jim's manager, and his wife, and Jim, Ed, and Maxine and Bonnie Brown. Here's the deal. They were on their way. They were flying on a aircraft furnished by the military. And they were, I think we lost you for a minute there, Frank. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, when they were on their way over the 57 trip, they left on April Fool's Day, and they were across the North Atlantic flying at night, and an engine caught fire. Now you can imagine how traumatic that would be for anybody.
Mm.
Out over water, not near land, and an engine catches fire. My friend Bill Larson, who ended up being one of Jim's charter pilots and became a very, very close friend of mine, who passed away a couple of years ago, told me that it was not terribly uncommon to have an engine fire. On the other hand, it wasn't real frequent. And the engines, even in those days, were designed to contain an element that would extinguish a fire, because sometimes that would happen. In this case, it was a broken fuel line. So one could say that that trip started off in a rather inauspicious manner. It got worse. They had a lot of fun going around Germany and so forth, but then they were going to fly to London. And they were on a paratrooper plane in which the seats were not facing forward the way it normally would be. They were facing sideways toward an aisle seat. So all the people that were on this were facing each other. And they even required through military protocol that they be wearing parachutes, including the ladies. Of course, they have to strap them up between their legs and so forth. And you can imagine these women, Del Wood, Mary Reeves, and others, having to cope with that while they're wearing dresses. Well, the problem is they neared London. London was fogged in, and they had a fuel shortage problem to be concerned about. And it was very nerve-wracking for everybody. At one point, one of the military guys asked everybody, have you ever parachuted? So the thought literally ran through their mind that they may have to ditch this plane, no kidding, and parachute. You can imagine a little trauma there.
Yeah.
Well, they circled and circled at a prolonged period of time, and they were circling quite low. And at lower altitudes, a plane like that was very bumpy. So passengers were getting sick. Finally, the pilot saw a little donut hole in the clouds and the fog, and he dove down to make it into that, through that, and land successfully. The plane ran out of gas as it was taxiing up to the hangar. And Billy Harlan, who was one of the musicians on the trip, was so sick, he had to wait and be taken off by ambulance, as I understand it, because he had been affected by vertigo. It's like getting seasick. So
Yeah.
this is the kind of thing that would happen to Jim and the other performers. So that was one of the big things. When Jim, kind of fast forwarding, Jim was aware that a number of people around Nashville, everybody from Roy Drusky to Farron Young, Bill Purcell, musicians and singers were learning how to fly. That was the craze. And in April of 1962, Jim lost his mind temporarily, and he got on a plane that was piloted by Farron Young. Now,
Oh
not to
boy.
disparage Farron, he was a talented guy, but he was quite the booze hound. And
Yeah.
he did not have a pilot's license, and he certainly was not authorized to take any passengers. Yet, according to Jim's diaries and fuel receipts that I have, Jim accompanied Farron on his plane, on Farron's plane, on a trip to Chicago, just to have fun, I guess. And it's worth noting that later on, after Jim got killed, Farron was on a radio show that I heard. I have a tape of it. And he did a mea culpa. He said he blamed himself for kindling Jim's interest in flying, because he encouraged him, Jim, if I can do it, you can do it. And I think
Mm.
Jim believed that. But noteworthy was that Farron got into trouble flying over East Tennessee, got lost in the Smoky Mountains in the cloud cover, was panic stricken, reached the controller. They tried to give him directions in the parlance of aviation. He couldn't understand it, but he did somehow miraculously manage to land, and he walked away from the plane and never flew again. So he blamed himself for years for putting the idea in Jim's mind that he could fly.
So so
Um,
far, so far, you've given us a bunch of reasons why Jim shouldn't have flown, why Jim should have said, "Boy, this scares me." But clearly, that's not the path he took.
And I can't explain that. I don't think Mary Reeves would be able to answer
Yeah.
the question either if you asked her. But I can tell you that Jim's problems with aircraft continue. When he and the Blue Boys and Chet Atkins flew over to South Africa for the first time in August of 1962, Jim kept a travel diary, which, by the way, he'd also done back in 54. He was very good about taking notes day by day. He began writing in his travel diary, a copy of which I have, while he was still on the tarmac at Nashville's Berry Field. And he noted in the first couple of sentences he was very nervous about this trip. Of course, by that point, he was flying on jet aircraft commercially. Well, they get to South Africa, and unfortunately, things turn for the worse. Teal Records, who was the RCA licensee over there, had chartered an aircraft that was a Viking model 1945 aircraft with fabric covered wings. And I
Hey.
could spend the rest of the time talking about the problems with that, but among them were the fact that the heater aboard the plane only operated off of the starboard engine, the one on the right. And that darn pesky right engine would occasionally fail. So
Right.
while they're airborne,
Wow.
so that presented problems. But just to give you an example of some of the things that Jim ran into, they were flying down to Cape Town one time, and it was a night trip. Jim had wanted to perform for a Black audience. I'll never forget. Of course, this is apartheid South Africa. I was in the Jim Reeves home down in his studio with Mary Reeves one time. We were talking about this, and she said Jim almost precipitated an international incident because he insisted on playing for a Black audience, not a segregated audience. And they were doing this on a Sunday night. And on the way down there, they ran into very bad weather. Now, just to point out, because it's south of the equator, people don't stop and realize this. The seasons are the exact opposite for those of us who live north of the equator. For example, when they were there in August, it was their winter. So Jim was performing outside in soccer stadiums. They had the big light, big, barrels with flame just to keep people, warm. So on this flight, they were running into bad weather at night, and the pilot had to leapfrog over bad weather. So he informed the passengers they needed to sit very, very still, not walk around, not exert themselves. And he took that plane up to 17,000 feet, and it was unpressurized cabin. You're not supposed to exceed about 14,000 feet, or there's a risk you could pass out. As it happened, some of the passengers suffered the ill effects. Mrs. McGrath, who was the wife of the promoter who went along on the trip, had a broken eardrum, and other people had nosebleeds. The Blue Boys finished every drop of alcohol that they could find on that aircraft. They landed about an hour before the performance. Jim commented to the audience that he was blue with cold. He said they managed to get us here somehow, but I don't know how they did it. And he did probably one of the worst shows he'd ever done.
Hmm.
Picked on Leo Jackson and threatened to fire him. But poor Leo was just inebriated from having, been through this traumatic experience. That wasn't the end of the problems in South Africa. Jim's diary recorded daily worries about being on that plane. On one occasion, on a day off, the performers were all going to go to, I believe it's called the Kruger National Park, Game Preserve. And they're underway during good weather during the daytime. And then the pilot discovered he didn't have all the charts, the navigation charts with him. So one of the passengers thought he could assist, so he was up in the cockpit. That still didn't solve the problem. So they ended up landing in a cow pasture in order to regroup. And first they circled low over this pasture, but it was full of cattle. And somehow, miraculously, a little South African boy on a bicycle understood what was happening with this plane circling over. And he managed to scatter those cattle. How do you get a herd of cattle to move? But he managed. So the plane was able to land, bouncing as it did. And they all got off the plane, relieving themselves, but thank God. And there was a stewardess on board this aircraft, and she served a picnic lunch on this pasture. But there were a number of occasions that I could go into that were scary. I won't take the time to do that, but they were landing one time at a precarious time. Right engine failed again. The prop just rolled over. And another time they came down on a runway and they bounced off the runway and came down so hard that the Teal representatives there to meet them said, we expected to have to identify the bodies. So when Jim got back from his South African tour, he resolved he was going to fly. And that's exactly what he decided to do. He took lessons from the coal mill flying service, specifically George Mummert, who was regarded as a very good instructor, by the way. And he first started out in a Cessna that wasn't a really high speed. It was a 4-passenger aircraft, kind of a learner type aircraft. And he was doing all right on that, but he got a little bit overconfident. And it was reported in November of '63. Oh, by the way, let me digress a little. Jim started to, as he got interested in aviation, he started to charter planes. His 2 charter pilots were Glenn Kemp and also Bill Larson. And Glenn allowed Jim to fly a twin-engine airplane, had the Blue Boys in the back of it, just, under supervision, and fly it for a brief, like 5-minute period. And Glenn reported to me that on one occasion, as they were coming into a Texas airport, Jim stalled the aircraft, scared everybody aboard. The buzzer sounded and all that. And Bud Logan was just freaked out by this. And of course, Glenn took over the controls of the aircraft again and got things settled down. Another time, Glenn was flying Jim and Dean out of a place that they had been, a fishing trip actually, in Florida. And for some reason, Glenn was aware that Jim didn't fully appreciate the dangers of bad weather and the necessity to avoid it. So there was a storm up ahead, and Glenn said, I deliberately put the aircraft through that, and it did pretty much what I knew it was going to do. It really shook everybody up. And I thought I broke Jim from the idea of disregarding bad weather because it was really turbulent. So then we also have anecdotes from Bill Larson, who flew Jim and the Blue Boys on charter flights, including to the Pacific Northwest in March, April, and May of '63. He too realized that Jim was not ready to get a pilot's license. He also didn't know that Jim and the Blue Boys were going to make an important trip to Ireland. And we can talk about that. That's worth a video separately about just the Irish trip sometime. They had a great time, but there were logistic problems and so forth. But Jim came home and he was not well. And he went to his doctor and got a medical excuse that Jim had been told, supposedly by his doctor, to take several months off. And this was used as an excuse for Jim to get out of contracts to perform. In other words, cancel shows that he had scheduled that were upcoming. 2 days after his doctor said he was not fit to perform, Jim got his pilot's license on June 30th of 1963. Now, he didn't hire an FAA examiner like Bill Whitmore or one of the other guys. He hired a guy named Elmo Merriweather, who was widely regarded around Nashville. They called him Santa Claus because he was unduly impressed by celebrity clients. And he was of a mind to believe that he was going to put something in your stocking, specifically a pilot's license, if you put something in his first, meaning some money. And Jim went ahead and had Elmo Merriweather give him the flying exam, even though he knew that Randy Hughes had also used him for a similar purpose. And need I remind people what happened to Randy Hughes? The Patsy Cline plane crash.
Right, right.
So
a year earlier.
There's no way. And Jim, in November of 1963, keep in mind he got his pilot's license. It was announced in Music Reporter magazine, run by Charlie Lamb, that Jim was taking advanced lessons on how to become a pilot and fly a faster aircraft, one that would be a 6-seater. This is actually going to be a Cessna to begin with. but it was going to have a variable pitch propeller, cowl flaps, a more complicated and faster aircraft. And people that read this who knew Jim's flying history were aghast. But as Mary commented, he wanted to fly, and that's what he did. She tried to talk him out of it. She'd actually been a good sport, by the way, and helped him with his lessons and reading him questions, from his lesson plans and helping him. And when they would fly together, she would help him with the navigation. He was only qualified for VFR rules, visual flight rules, in which he had to be able to know landmarks, have clear enough weather that he could orient the plane to the ground and so forth. He was not qualified to fly by instruments or IFR rating. Well, this little item appears in November 63, and who sees it but Fred Bunyan, who's an aggressive salesman for Southeast Beechcraft, which has an office at the Nashville airport. So he approaches Jim about buying a Beechcraft Debonair, which is also referred to as a doctor and lawyer killer, because these guys that are wealthy enough to afford one of these aircraft, and they're quite expensive, end up killing themselves because they're busy men, like Jim was, and they don't have enough time. Now, Fred Bunyan was supposed to certify that Jim had enough time to even begin instruction on this aircraft. He required, under FAA rules, 200 flight hours. Jim had barely 100, according to his logbook. He should have never been in that aircraft to begin with. But on June, try this again. On January 19th of 64, Jim and Fred boarded a commercial airline and flew from Nashville to Atlanta to pick up a brand new plane of Beechcraft Debonair that Fred was in hopes Jim would purchase. And he allowed, under supervision, Jim to fly it back to Nashville. And then Jim proceeded over the next few months to rent it anytime he wanted to go to Texas to see a gal that he liked over there named Judy Ford, whom we haven't talked about, 22 years old, or see his friend Ted Staples. I'll never forget Ted, who's still alive, a very good friend of mine, one of Jim's best friends, by the way, was so surprised. He picked up Jim at the airport in Texas one day, and he said, well, where's the pilot? Jim said, me. Ted almost fainted. He could not believe. And Ted took him to his house, and he met Ted's father, and he really bore down on Jim and said, Jim, you're going to kill yourself. Leave the flying to, in fact, he said the same thing Glenn Kemp did. Kemp said, Jim, I don't mind if you get a plane, but let me do the flying. So everybody was on Jim's back, trying to dissuade him from doing this. But anyway, Jim proceeded to learn how to fly the beach. Fred Bunyan helped give him instruction. Ray Baker, who handled Jim's song publishing companies, worked out of Jim's home office, went with him. And he told me a couple of occasions. On one occasion, he went for a checkout ride with Fred Bunyan and Jim. And Fred put Jim through his paces and asked him to, at one point, stall the aircraft, which is a normal training procedure. And Jim started to do it, which is pitching the nose of the plane upward so it becomes unairworthy, and then recovering as it starts to decline. Jim chickened out. And Fred told him, no, you've got to do this. You've got to do this. So Jim did it successfully. And Ray was sitting behind Jim. And he said, I could see the hairs on the back of Jim's neck standing up. He was so frightened by doing that. The last time that Ray flew with him, they were practicing touch and go. So they take off and then land. And on one of the occasions, it was a very hot day. Briefly, Ray had opened the passenger side door just to let some air circulate in the plane. And then he slammed it shut, and then they took off down the runway. Well, all of a sudden, there was a banging noise on the plane, and Jim freaked out and said, what's that? What's that? And what had happened was, when Ray had shut the door, one of the belts, the seat belts on the aircraft, was caught in the door. It was flapping against the side of the fuselage, but it totally freaked out Jim. And Ray said, when I saw his panic, I never got in that plane again. I made an excuse, said I was ill. I needed to get out of that plane. Okay, let's fast forward to when Jim got killed. Jim and Mary had gone to Texas to visit family. And they'd flown back. This is 1 week before Jim got killed. They were in the Beechcraft Avenue. Mary told me herself that she had seen how Jim had handled himself when running into bad weather. He was calm, cool, and collected, very professional. Well, she didn't tell me all the story. I talked to Billy Perryman, who was the wife of Tom Perryman. Tom and Billy were longtime business acquaintances and good friends of Jim and Mary. Billy told me on that last trip to Texas, on the way back, that Jim made Mary cry because she was so frightened by the experience. And Fred Bunyan confirmed that Jim landed in Nashville. This is 1 week before he got killed. Mary as his passenger, landed just ahead of an intense thunderstorm, and they scrambled the ground crew out to retrieve that aircraft and hurriedly get it in the hangar to protect it from this violent storm that was unleashed. And then they were all trapped in the hangar for a while, waiting for the storm to leave so that they could even leave the hangar. So Mary made Jim promise that he would never, ever, ever get that close to a storm again. It's 1 week before he got killed.
Now, before we wrap up, let's get to the. First of all, I want to stop for a second and talk to those of you who are watching this. And if you're watching this thinking, man, the details this author knows are just incredible. I promise you this, Larry's barely scratching the surface to what you're going to read in the book, Jim Reeves' Untold Story, and also what you're going to listen to in the audiobook, Jim Reeves' Untold Story. The detail's incredible. And of course, Larry, as we record this in 2025, it was 61 years ago
Right.
when Jim died in the plane crash, and yet the details you have about leading up to the plane crash and then the day of the plane crash and what happened are just incredible. Talk a little bit about the day of the crash.
Well, Jim had money burning a hole in his pocket. He was interested in exploring investment opportunities for real estate and development, both in Texas and also in Arkansas, because he had some buddies in West Arkansas who had been successful in these ventures. And so he asked Dean Manuel, who was from Batesville, Arkansas, if he knew anybody there. And so Dean wrote his uncle, George Parks. And George replied and suggested that Jim contact a realtor, Clyde Griffith. What Mr. Parks inexplicably did not tell Jim was that this man at the moment was out on bail for having murdered two people, a husband and wife, over a real estate dispute. I am confident Jim would have never gone and met that man and probably would have never made the trip and never would have gotten killed.
Hmm.
This information apparently was withheld from him. This is not the way that Jim conducted his life, but he flew to Batesville naively thinking he was going to be conferring with a realtor who would help him. They got there and looked at a little bit of land late in the afternoon on Thursday, July 30th. By the way, when they took off from the airport, he was originally, let me back up a moment, he was going to fly on Wednesday, but they had a downpour. So he called and canceled the flight on Wednesday. He talked to Bill Larson, who was out at the airport, involved with the charter service. So Bill said to Jim, well, if you're not going to fly today on Wednesday, I'm going to take the plane down to Chattanooga and see my girlfriend, Beulah. And he did. And he brought it back the next morning. Bill Larson was at the airport when Jim and Dean arrived to fuel, and he was fueling the aircraft. And Jim tried to convince Bill to accompany them. And of course, Bill spent the rest of his life regretting he didn't agree, but he had a charter flight. All right, so they get started on Thursday. They fly into Batesville, Arkansas, look at a little bit of land. They spend Thursday night at the home of Mr. and Mrs. George Parks, who are the aunt and uncle of Dean Manuel. He also called Ted Staples around 9 o'clock Thursday night to confirm that Ted was still going to be arriving in Nashville over the weekend. The plan was Ted was going to ride up with some friends of his, visit the Reeveses on the weekend, and then Jim and the band were coming back on Big Blue, the bus, the following week to play show dates in Texas. So Ted Staples was one of the last people to talk to Jim Reeves. Okay, as Friday dawns, it's foggy, so they have to hang around the George Parks house. They quickly look at some real estate supposedly during the midday. Then Jim wanted to stop and see a guy at Rimrock Records, Wayne Rainey, waited for him. He wasn't there. So Mrs. Rainey fed him lunch. They're looking at the clock. Jim decides we better get going. We just got to get back home. And Jim kind of suffered from what we would call, some pilots call get there itis. He went back to the Parks residence, and Jim called the Walnut Ridge at a little after 2 o'clock that afternoon and got a weather briefing that later investigation established was, quote, substantially correct. Then they hurried to get back to the motel, and they hurried so quickly that Dean even forgot his shaving kit. By the way, Mrs. Parks tried to prevail upon them to stay overnight because the sky was becoming very threatening. The clouds were already building at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Batesville, Arkansas. Storm front was approaching, but Jim said he had important business. Well, the important business was that his ex-bandmate, Tommy Hill, and his good songwriter friend, Hank Cochran, who were roommates and lived just down the street from Jim and Mary, were going to have a big barbecue. And generally, when there was a big barbecue in the afternoon and evening, Jim got to meet some interesting people, some of whom were female. So Jim wanted to get home. So they make the mad dash to the airport. Jim calls a second time, Walnut Ridge. Before he takes off, he uses a drop line phone. I should explain that there really wasn't an airport. There was a landing strip, a fuel pump, and a drop line phone, and it was behind a general store. Just a general store. They kind of had a dual purpose there. And he would, pay for fuel at the general store and so forth. Just before taking off, they had one last little treat. Dean went up in the general store and bought them both ice cream cones. So that was the last little treat that Jim and Dean had. They left Batesville around 2:45 p.m. in the afternoon. And Jim made contact with Dyersburg en route. They did not stop at Dyersburg, Tennessee. Patsy Cline did, but Jim and Dean had no reason to. And Jim was getting periodic weather updates. The weather was reasonably good. There was no storm front that he had to fly through. In fact, the weather was better than it had been the week before. And I'm afraid that persuaded Jim that this is a piece of cake. He could fly around anything. And the sky wasn't as ominous as it had been the week before when he successfully landed. So he's approaching, he makes contact. And by the way, in my book, I have the exact timestamps and a recitation of the conversation between Jim and the tower, specifically John Heddish, the controller, whom I interviewed twice. All of that's contained in the long lost accident report. And I would be willing to guarantee everybody that's watching this, they will not be able to get a copy of the accident report. That has been purged from federal agency files. And we should do, Frank, a separate little thing about the whole controversy around that, suspicious things surrounding the plane crash, and even a connection with the JFK assassination. So that's a little.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? I think, and by the way, folks, for every time you've heard Larry stop and say, by the way, there are like 100 more by the ways in the book for every time you say, by the way. So I think, Larry, in the spirit of, all the details you have here, I'm thinking we ought to do a part 2, and I'm thinking the part 2 ought to be a lot of the details about the plane crash.
Actually, what happened?
Yes, what happened? Yeah, what happened? And I'd be interested in that, and we could do that for our next session. Does that work for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let's do that. And folks, let me just put this up on the screen. Now, if you're on a phone, this may not be as clear to you, but again, the book, Jim Reeves, His Untold Story by Larry Jordan. It's a terrific book if you want to read it. It's a terrific audiobook if you want to listen to it. And it's available on both Amazon and Audible. And you got to get this book. It's great. As you've heard me say before, Larry, as a narrator, I've narrated over 150 books. A narrator does not have to enjoy the books that he's narrating, but when he does, it's just like, it's like coming to work on Christmas every day, but you're Santa Claus. I mean, to use Santa Claus twice in this. So I've just really enjoyed it. So I think you will too, folks. So Larry,
I just want to leave
yeah,
fans
go
with
ahead.
the idea that
Yeah.
when we discuss in the next video what happened, you will conclude, as many have, this did not need to happen.
Ah,
This is a tragedy that was an avoidable tragedy, not just in the sense of his training, but the minute by minute sequence will establish all that.
let's
And
end. Yeah. Let's end on that. And again,
uh,
having read the book, I know exactly what you're talking about. So, all right, again, Jim Reeves, his Untold Story, author Larry Jordan. Larry, thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. Thanks
Thank
very much.
you.